Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. I guess first of all, thanks to Kia and Gloria, Mark, who sort of organise all these awards, and as I know there's a lot of work to it in terms of the reviewers and things like that as well. I'm Chris Elsden. Thanks very much for coming to the furthest away room. And it's really nice to see some people who've supported me and inspired me at various points in the room. Yeah, and I'm just very honoured and grateful to get the chance to talk about this work again at CHI. So I currently work in design informatics at the University of Edinburgh. Until very recently I was at Northumbria University, but this dissertation took place at Newcastle. And before I start, there's a lot of people that I need to acknowledge, and these are just a few of the people who in particular have hugely contributed to me being here right now. All I can say is that they're all brilliant, and if you get a chance to work with them, then grab it as you can. And especially thanks to Dave Kirk and Abby Durant, who really nourished me and gave me just the right amount of freedom and not too much freedom that I did anything stupid. So my thesis this is my thesis title: A Quantified Past, Fieldwork and Design for Remembering a Data-Driven Life. And the sort of genesis of my thesis begins here with this quote from Gary Wolfe. Gary Wolfe is one of the founders of the Quantified Self movement. He's an editor of Wired magazine. And when I began my thesis, Quantified Self, sort of 2013-14, probably at a peak moment of breaking into the mainstream, but still felt like this quite strange Silicon Valley practice, and rather peculiar. So Gary Wolfe talked about a data-driven life in a New York Times article, and said, for a long time, only one area of human activity appeared to be immune. In the cosy confines of personal life, we rarely used the power of numbers. The imposition on oneself or one's family of a regime of objective record-keeping seemed ridiculous. A journal was respectable, a spreadsheet was creepy. And I think it's really this creepiness that I found the most interesting thing to begin with, the idea that keeping a spreadsheet about yourself, representing yourself in a quantified and data-driven fashion, the sort of peculiar, creepy nature of that, yet at the same time the enthusiasm that's around it. And so when I started my thesis, I had the vague idea I was supposed to do something about memory and digital technologies. So I started to think about the personal histories that this kind of activity in data would generate. And at the same time, Nicholas Felton, who's a self-tracker and graphic designer, had already started producing these incredible quantified annual reports about his life to kind of already demonstrate the kind of potential of a quantified past. And so in the thesis, one of the main contributions is a conceptualization of what a quantified past is. But I was really interested in the experience of remembering a data-driven life. What does this feel like to have this kind of data? And what does it mean for us being human to create these kinds of records of our lives? And further, I was trying to be quite productive in the sense of developing design considerations for services and technologies that would support us remembering, or at least having a better relationship with this quantified past, whatever it was. I think my work's quite part of a critical turn towards the design of self-tracking tools in HCI. I think sometimes at CHI we can be quite hard on ourselves in terms of our ability to be reflective and critical, but I think this area is a really interesting one where we look back at some of the first sort of seminal papers in this space, which are about kind of very rational, stage-based psychological models, hacking habits for health and happiness. And then as we've gone along, we've kind of developed much more detailed and nuanced picture of what it means to live with these kinds of tools, from lived informatics, awareness of the politics of data and quantification in general in these tools. And I see my own work as part of this kind of critical turn. And I think as a community, actually, we can be proud of quite a lot of the work we now do in this area, and it allows us to, examine quite, sensitive areas as well. On the memory side, I've drawn a lot on the field of memory studies, which is an interdisciplinary field, but it adopts a broadly sociocultural and phenomenological view of memory. For me, there was a very important focus on the experience of remembering as a verb, as an action, as a process, rather than simply memories as an archive or as a pure recall. I was interested in what it means to remember, not simply that we can remember. In this sense, the work of Frederick Bartlett is very important in sort of establishing remembering as an imaginative reconstruction. It's not simply the re-excitation of innumerable fixed lifeless fragmentary traces. It's something very imaginative and reconstructive and human. And similarly, in a more contemporary work, Middleton and Brown really set out the case for this and for memory as a present-focused action. And And so this is kind of echoed in a lot of previous HCI work as well, and our very orientation to digital records and digital possessions, and the idea that if we take things as a resource for action, then we might design lots of memory and digital possessions very differently, rather than thinking about them purely as sources of record or recall. This quote really sums up, I guess, why I found my thesis so interesting and why it was a really, really rich space to work in. And it's from one participant who said, obviously, I don't take the data as a, this is what happened, but at the same time, your memory doesn't always remember things in the correct way either. And I think ultimately my thesis worked because of the interesting overlap between and tension between data and remembering. And while a data-driven life, as it's presented to us in most applications, is one of quite radical individual self-optimization and rationalism, remembering is a far more constructive and human activity. It requires us to do very different things with data than we might be accustomed to with self-tracking apps, particularly in the fitness and wellness kind of areas. Of course, though, both are intensely related to personal identity. I'm just going to give a really high-level summary of the studies I undertook in the thesis and this papers, which go into much more detail. But I began trying to just find examples of a quantified past in the wild. Something that was quite important is that this is like a sort of very emerging phenomenon, and in many ways still is an emerging and anticipated phenomenon. I had two main pieces of fieldwork. Both of them were interview-based studies. The first one was with long-term self-trackers. I spoke to people using self-tracking a range of things, using a range of technologies, and some of them had records going back to 6 or 7 years. I got them to talk through their self-tracking practice and when, if at all, they looked back at these things, walking through the data with them during the interview. And so that was really telling that for some people this was the first time they'd looked back at that data or even realized that it had anything meaningful to say about them in a retrospective way. I also did a study with around diary keeping and what we called smart journals, a sort of range of apps that allow you to capture and document different media about your life. And this was really helped to see how people were interweaving a variety of media, including some quantified data, to try and document their lives, and also understanding the really distinct and different reasons and approaches people have to documenting their lives. People keep diaries for really, really different reasons, and that really kind of helped to understand the qualities of different media in helping people achieve their goals in that regard. As I say, I'll point to the papers for most of the kind of findings and really, kind of the data. But we got things like this as well. So this is like a year's worth of Nike Plus data. Many of these things are ignored. People hadn't looked at them before. And there was quite a bit of surprise about how telling they could be, but some of it was quite treasured by people as well. We also saw some in the diaries examples of people recording prices and using quantitative data already to write things down and record them about themselves, and sort of numerous smart journal apps like this. So in the thesis, we start to try and distinguish and summarize some characteristics of a quantified past, like what makes this different from other kinds of media, why is this different from remembering with photographs or with a diary or something else. And there's sort of 6 qualities that we sort of distinguish and starting to think towards how do we start to design with this in mind. Some of those are experiential. Quantified past is generally passive and third party, so it's generally something that's going on in the background. It's not as kind of active as you taking a photograph. It's egocentric. It's generally taken as a selfie. Most of the data we collect, at least in this guise, is about yourself. And it's removed from the past as remembered. It's quite distinct. It's got qualities that are quite different from the way that we tend to remember, say, in a visual sense as well. Materialistically, it's obviously quantitative and very much presented in an objective and kind of very precise way, very determinatively saying you did 9,872 steps. And there's no question that might be wrong, or that might be something else in between, or there might be something more to it than that. Our experience is abstracted, it's reductive, it's commensurated. That's the value of data, that we can compare different sets of steps, even if 10,000 of them were around this amphitheatre and 10,000 of them on your commute. In terms of the data, that can very often be commensurated and the same. And of course it's amorphous in the sense that this data could be represented in many different fashions, and I'd argue that we're really very limited in the way that it's currently represented to us. I just want to highlight one thing around that was quite interesting about the field work, and it continues to really interest me, is that a key feature of this field work was about getting people to talk around through their own data. And we became attentive to the rhetoric and the talk that was required to really make sense of data. And the data certainly doesn't speak for itself, as much as we're promised about how much insight and rich meaning it's going to bring to us. The term data work has been used previously and a few times since in slightly different ways, but broadly it acknowledges that the data doesn't work on its own. And so a lot of the data we have is there's lots of these words like apparently this, and I don't really believe it, or it doesn't feel like very much, or I don't know, maybe people negotiating or trying to understand or trying to, in this case, achieve some sense of verisimilitude between what the data says and their own remembering, going back to that quote from a participant earlier. However, sort of following this fieldwork, as I said before, there's a kind of anticipatory and sort of emerging phenomenon. And that's quite a challenge to study things that are just in that near future. And so I turned to speculative methods, but I wanted to do more than just provoke or critique. And I really was intrigued about how can we do more kind of empirical studies with such emerging and anticipated phenomena. And so through the thesis and collaborating with a lot of colleagues, developed an approach called speculative enactments. This first came to life in a project called metadating, where we used a live speed dating event to get people to explore how they would talk about themselves and represent themselves with data in a sort of very live, romantic context. And so in the thesis, I looked at this in the context of contemporary weddings and viewed weddings as a really rich sort of documentary context through which I could start to speculate about how people might record their lives with data. So I developed a speculative service called Abacus to document one's wedding with data. This entailed a kind of research through design approach to this service, and then a number of other sort of interviews and things, and then ultimately meeting with two engaged couples and sort of posing or engaging with them as a datagrapher, like a photographer for data, and to get them to think about and choose ways in which they might try to document their wedding with data. What would they try to capture, and what qualities would data bring to that might be different or distinct from other media? And then finally, this produced a sort of promotional brochure about the service, which they were a part. So it created some consequence to their involvement in this speculation with me. There's a series of documentary data artifacts that we then designed, and they explore the kind of semiotics of remembering with data, the importance of curation, the way that data can act as an alternative lens, and particularly playing around with the sense that a wedding, there's a sort of magic to this big day, and there's a lot of and how do we get data to reflect that, and perhaps in a poetic fashion. The sort of final concept we come up with in terms of a design approach concerns what we call documentary informatics. And really this is about the fact that data becomes meaningful when people are able to make it accountable to their experience. So it's really clear that the purpose of documenting a wedding is not to obtain a complete and unerring record of the day, but it's valuable when it's a resource for you to do particular kinds of remembering with particular social ends. You need a photograph to put in your hall, you need something to put on your invites, you need something to give to your parents, you need something to reminisce with your partner. These are the things that remembering is valuable for. And so what we argue is that we need to support people doing this very subjective and contextual sense-making of their data, rather than designing data as some sort of objective truth that might be powerful in and of itself. Again, there's a paper talking a little bit more about that. But what's clear is that this is a very distinct approach to how we might design these tools compared to self-tracking tools that focus on self-optimization or health and wellness. I'm just going to finish up, I guess, with the pleasure of hindsight. Kind of think a couple of things that I think are still interesting and things that I think have reflected on since if I was to do the thesis again now. The first is that my work was ultimately quite focused on individuals, or at least couples, and very much that kind of individual experience of remembering, and my methods were all tailored around that. But I think there's some really interesting space around the sort of quantified past and the more social history, and what kinds of social and collective remembering might be afforded by the quantified records that we're inevitably creating and collecting now. We could question what kinds of history are being written in an increasingly data-driven society, and how are those different from the other kinds of archives that we might have collected before. And then finally, and perhaps most critically, like many of us, I'm becoming more aware and more concerned around the sort of surveillance, and obviously quantified self and surveillance have been intimately linked for a long time, but I think this, particularly now, this seems more relevant than ever, and I sort of recognise that if we were to sort of, if this was to be hugely successful and loads of companies went, hey, we need to make some documentary informatics, and followed all of our wonderful design considerations, the data they produce wouldn't be locked in a bedside cabinet, it wouldn't be in a photo album in the attic, and instead, simultaneously, whatever experiences they gave the users that they would value and we think would be interesting, they'd also support new opportunities to capitalize upon those experiences. And so I think it sort of illustrates the way in which we're aware more and more that our work has consequences beyond the immediate interaction and interface. And I think that's why CHI can be a very good venue for these types of discussions that cross a whole range of fields. And that's part of the reason that I'm sort of, again, so thankful and honoured to get this award. So thank you very, very much.
So we have time for a couple of questions. Yes?
Hi, Chris. I'm kind of continuing your thesis in my own work. It's very kind of impressive and inspiring. I'm looking at how kids are, teenagers are forming a sense of their own identity through these self-tracking data representations. And one way in which I'm seeing it is that self-tracking tools are a kind of way to play for adults. And the thing which I like about them, both the metadating situation and the wedding situation, is it's sort of, we're in on the fact that it's all kind of playing around. It's not really going to have this kind of meaning, and then through that, just through the process, we get to a sense of meaning. I wonder to what extent your participants took it seriously, because I hear a lot of quantified self saying, no, it has to be accurate, I need to know accuracy, whether your participants shared in the spirit of this is a kind of creative, playful process, or they were more towards less of accuracy. I want to know how many.
Yeah,
What was your name?
Kiro.
There's two quick points on that are quite interesting. One is in terms of the methods, that we were playing with that of trying to make an enjoyable and playful experience, but also one that was consequential for them. So when people were engaging in speculation, part of the speculative enactments work was like, if you can make their engagement more consequential in some way, like I've got to be impressive to this person on the date, or I've got to not embarrass myself in the next 5 minutes, you get more interesting and richer data out of it than when people are just mucking around. So that's one balance. Is always a challenge. I would argue that I guess the perspective that came through was that the meaning or the value of the data was not necessarily only related to the quality of the data itself. Like, obviously the data shouldn't be junk, but actually, particularly in the wedding context, what became valuable was like if the couple had done a lot of curatorial work around that data, or picked certain kinds of data out. Now, in a data science way, that's a very selective, unscientific thing to do, to just choose some parts and ignore others, but that could become very meaningful to someone to say, did you know our heart rate was this at this point in the day? So I think actually that the meaning's coming from the investment that they're able to make in it. And I'd say that a lot of tools at the moment don't really let us do that very much. Like, we just get it, and we just have to look at it, consume it, and then, you know, feel better or worse about ourselves about it.